All right, well, we're tracking the possibility for some coastal flooding ahead of king tides this weekend. You know what? Many communities are still working to recover from that severe flooding event we had a few weeks ago. So we really want to help prepare you for what's ahead. To do this, joining us live, coastal hazard specialist Ian Miller. Ian, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So we know that our upcoming king tide around across Puget Sound is not going to be nearly as bad as what we saw in late December. Can you explain to viewers how a storm system can enhance these king tides?
Yeah, so king tides are what we refer to as these predictable, higher than average tides. And they're predictable because they're driven by astronomical forces, the configuration of the Earth, the moon, and the sun. And they can create higher than normal high tides, and that is what we expect to see in this coming week, with the peak occurring, I think, on the 23rd or something along those lines. But weather can help the water go higher. And so the other thing to look for is if we do have a weather system moving through that brings with it low pressure, that can push the water even higher than predicted. And so when those two things co-occur, when we have an extra high tide, a king tide, coupled with weather helping it along, that's when we get our coastal flooding events.
Yeah, I mean, our event in late December was just so remarkable and dangerous because we had that very strong storm system coinciding with those king tides. So, Ian, we know things are going to be very different this weekend. How much weaker will be the impact from these king tides?
Well, it's not likely that we're going to see the same sorts of high water that we saw in the last week of December, but it will the high tides will still be higher than average. The predicted high tide for Seattle, for example, for the January 23rd is I'm sorry. Well, January 23rd, 24th, and 25th are all about 1.5 feet higher than the average high tide, right? So the water's going to be high, and noticeably so. But if we have, again, some sort of weather moving through, especially when those high tides peak, which is early in the morning, between around 7 a.m. in Seattle, then the water will be pushed higher. And again, it's not likely that just because of the weather forecast, it's not likely that we see the same sort of record high water level, which is what occurred in the last week of December, but it'll still be noticeable.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we're tracking the weather systems here in the Weather Center. I mean, it looks like we're going to have much quieter weather and higher pressure compared to what we saw in late December. So Mother Nature hopefully helping us out. But we know that even minor flooding can be an impact. So can you explain the minor impacts that we can expect going forward?
Yeah, so typically these sorts of king tide events, especially when they're helped along a little bit by a winter storm or low pressure, they can do things like flood low-lying roads, flood low-lying yards. People whose homes are particularly low might see some minor flooding into and around structures, but it's not likely that we see the sort of wide-scale flooding across Puget Sound that affects multiple buildings in the same way that we saw at the end of December.
And so for the coast, like La Push, Westport, starting to see the king tide Saturday, but for Seattle, Olympia, and Shelton, that will get going on Monday. Ian Miller, thanks so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. All right, Brian.